Mitch Gray, it's always good to see you again. Of course, we are now in season 2, episode 1 of the Question Guy podcast. So, like we did with the season 1, you are my first guest. But I did this intentionally because there's something that just can't kind of came up, all of a sudden about the discussion of leadership. And I'm moving into a space where I'm talking about leadership, reflection, journaling, and really taking an assessment perspective on your own actions. Because I think without that, you can't really do the frontline stuff. And I know everybody talks about the frontline stuff of leaders, right? They've got to do this and they got to do that. And and that's all well and good, but I think without being able to reflect upon what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it, you're really going to miss the mark. And as well as anybody other than me, I've got a PhD. And so I've got a PhD in education, and my studies were in school administration. And so, I was taught from an academic perspective management theory, leadership theory, and what to do. And so there's a couple of different, you know, specific leadership theories that are out there. And there's always that one that says, well, people are born to be a leader, right? And
Mm,
I think now it's termed, and I'm looking at my notes, the great man theory, when it should be the great person theory at this point, political correctness. But it's the great man theory. But then there's the opposite, saying that you can really develop your skills as a leader, but then there's always the contingency and the behavioral, and there's so many different theories, quote unquote, out there to guide and direct your behavior. But I'm still thinking, especially since you and we've been talking for 2 years, and you never once in any of our discussions mention academics or theory in terms of applying strategic leader, and I'll even use that word, strategic
yeah,
leadership,
yeah,
when we're communicating and guiding and leading people. And that's really the
mhm,
end of it all. We're guiding, leading people to an objective.
right.
Now, of course, it is situational, because you could look at that from, you know, politics, military, teams, business, small business, and it's all going to have different, perspectives. But at the end of the day, you're leading people, and a theory can only take you so far.
Mhm.
And I know I've talked too much already, and I usually do at the opening
It's okay.
of all my conversations. But I was just kind of inspired to kind of think about that and saying, well, wait a
Right,
second.
right.
Um, I know about leadership theory, but I I want to reflect upon my actions and how I'm impacting people. And Mitch, I really want to know what you think about all this.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations on season one. I think you had like 40
I'm
episodes.
going for a 40
Oh,
episode season. So yeah, I've
yeah,
got 40,
awesome.
and they were tremendous conversations.
Yeah, no, you're doing a great job, and unlike as far as I know, unlike anyone else listening to your show or watching it, I've seen the groundwork laid, and the idealism and the heartache and the anxiety and everything that's gone into what you're doing. So really, really good job. Celebrate that.
Oh, I appreciate that.
That's a huge feat. Yeah, it's a
40
huge
great
feat.
conversations though. And
Yeah,
I'll be
great.
honest, I did the count. You're in
Yeah.
8 of them.
Hey, our contract said 8 or 9 every season, and our contract said that I open every season. So I'm fully expecting all of
I'm
that.
good, man.
Second of all, it's interesting. uh, I always have to share a story because I always life is so full of stories. I feel like I'm never ending the never ending storyteller. Talking about education years and years ago, almost a decade and a half ago, I guess, or longer. Um, there was a dear lady who. So I was actually working full time in ministry at the time, but I was also doing. I've spent quite a few years in my adult life doing mental health
Okay.
um, counseling, especially in public schools. I've never done it full time. It's always kind of been a part time funded position. oftentimes in schools that maybe didn't have the resources to bring in someone full time. And so I've been very fortunate to, and it aligned perfectly with everything I love doing. So anyway, I was doing some work in a real rural city and school at one point, and there was one lady in particular that, if I remember right, I think she was like the executive assistant on one of the campuses or something. So I had to have a lot of engagement with her. You go on
So
campus.
public school, you're talking public
Yes,
school?
public
Okay.
school. Yeah, public school. You have to go on campus and check in and, check out. And so I had a lot of engagement with her. And my dad always taught me as a kid that, you find the gatekeeper, you find the person that really holds the power. And normally that's the assistant or the secretary.
Right,
And
right.
so I've always kind of been, you always want to treat people the right way. So anyway, her and I over a few years built a really interesting relationship in a good way. Now, let me back up and say she was very well known for being the queen bee on campus because she took her responsibility as the gatekeeper very seriously.
Huh.
And she rarely laughed. She rarely smiled. I mean, it was like stern faced. And well, what my dad also taught me is anytime someone is that stern in their personality, your new challenge is to get them to laugh or smile. And I saw my dad do that as a kid, I don't know, a million times. I mean, that just became his thing. And so I kind of took that on. And the cool thing about that strategy is it does lead, because sometimes you're the only person that can kind of get them to smile or laugh during their day. So her and I built a really good relationship. Well, one day I walk in to check in to go to my sessions, and she said, "Hey, I have something for you." And I said, "Okay." Well, she had created and printed off a diploma, a certification, and framed it and gave it to me. And I'm not going to tell you what it says yet because I need to back up even more. So we were talking one time, and I've had this happen multiple times in life. Her and I got to talking about education, and she looked at me and said, "So where did you get your PhD?"
She
And I
asked,
said, "Wait, oh yeah." And I have that happen to me often. Where did
okay,
I get my PhD? And a lot of that is because I sit at the table as a consultant or an advisor to a lot of very high educated people.
right.
So the assumption is that Mitch, has that, high of an
Credential, yeah.
education. Yeah. And so, which is a compliment. And I said, no, I don't have my PhD. And she said, "Wait, what?" Like she said, "I just the way you carry yourself and the work you do and the way you talk." And I was like, no. So, well, what she had printed was, because my comment was, and it often is as a joke, I do have a PhD in the School of Hard Knocks, and that's the most valuable PhD anyone can ever have. Well, she had printed off this certificate diploma, Mitch Gray, PhD, School of Hard Knocks, and she had even gone and gotten it certified by a notary public. And I still have that because I'm like, I could go finish my PhD and get it, and it still wouldn't mean as much to me as the lady known as the queen bee on campus, who no one could get past, gave me a gift that's my PhD in the School of Hard Knocks. And what does that have to do with leadership? It actually has everything to do with leadership. And so, really, more directly to your question, we have to first define leadership, regardless of what perspective we're coming from. And in general, I think everyone could come to an agreement that at its most fundamental definition, leadership is about making an impact. When you make an impact, you are now a leader. And I think, again, everyone at its most baseline level would say, yes, let's start there. We can agree on that. So let's just take that a little further. If we're going to say leadership at its most fundamental level is the definition of making an impact, well, then we have to take that further and pull that thread. And what that looks like is in the next phase is, well, then we have to conclude that everyone is a leader. Even
Because,
you're making an impact.
right.
Even a 3-year-old who shares a toy at preschool or cuts their sandwich in half because their friend Sam doesn't have a lunch. Is that 3-year-old not in that moment a leader? They're making an impact. And so we begin to dilute the most fundamental idea of leadership when we start throwing layers on top of it, theories, theologies, idiosyncrasies. Well, what really makes a leader? Then the question people ask is, well, what makes a good leader? So now we're differentiating good leaders from bad leaders. And someone would say, let's give the most obvious example. Well, Hitler was a terrible leader. Was he?
No, he wasn't.
Because Hitler made an indelible impact on many cultures. It may not have been with a positive motivational result, but when you just strip down the idea of leadership as making an impact, you can't. My point is, leadership in and of itself is neutral. The only way to measure the impact of leadership is by viewing the results of said impact. So I could be a leader and punch you in the face and take initiative, but then because of the result of my act, someone would say, well, that's poor leadership. But then we dilute it even more and say, well, that's not actually leadership. Okay, but hold on. If we're
We
going to bring it
defined it
down, then let's,
as.
yes, making an impact. And so my point to all of that is, I think what we've done and what we always do most of the time within our humanity is we don't want something to have such a shallow definition that it doesn't confuse everyone, because we like everyone to be confused, because then within our ego, we're needed. And so think about this for a second. If I'm an academic, I'm a PhD, and I need to advocate for my validity. And so now all of a sudden I need to create enough chaos that I'm still needed in the world. Well, I can't be an expert on leadership and come to the table with the basic definition of all leadership is making an impact, because that's not validating my ego enough to prove my value. But then you read people like the Buddha or Jesus Christ or Gandhi or Thich Nhat Hanh or Martin Luther King Jr. or anyone else that had all this amazing influence, and their definitions are so simple. So then you have to ask why. And the answer is easy. It's because they didn't worry about validity. The answer is simple. What is leadership? What is leadership? And
And
isn't
then
that really the answer?
the answer
Because
is the
really,
question. The question is the
yes.
answer.
And it goes back to your point, and connecting that is your rule of what I call the rule of reflection. By the way, I wrote about that in my last book. There's a
Did you
chapter
really?
on the rule. Yeah, the rule of reflection. And that's what you're alluding to is, if I don't have the space and the self-belief and humility to allow room for reflection, then how can I ever empower my response to leadership?
Well, can't we define leadership so that we know what we're talking about? Or didn't you just say that a bit earlier, that we really need to be clear when we're bringing up leaders and leadership in a discussion? We have to set the baseline as to what it is that we're talking about at that point, because at any point in time, in any conversation, in any context, we would all have different opinions or different
Yes,
perspectives on
yes.
what that leader should be, or what the definition should be. And then we're all trying to make our point known without collectively saying, okay, well, let's agree that if we look at it from this perspective, then we can reflect upon, is this individual really demonstrating good leadership?
Yeah, and oftentimes we're so focused on the manifestation of something like leadership that we forget leadership is like water. It's like anything else. It ebbs and flows. So let's take athletics for an example. Oftentimes you'll hear, well, that person is a great leader for their team because they are inspirational. They call people to duty. But then in the very next moment, we'll say, well, that person is a great leader for their team because they took control. But anywhere else in life, if we say inspiration and taking control, that's a total paradox. It's like, hold on a second. To be someone who's inspirational, don't you want to relinquish control and actually empower? And so my point to that is, it's not wrong. it can look differently and manifest differently and still be exactly what it is. And so where we're
In
going is,
context.
yes, that's exactly right. It's going to be like water. Sometimes it's a powerful waterfall. Sometimes it's a calm river. Sometimes it's a stagnant lake. Sometimes it's a nutrition to the body. But guess what it is?
So is
It's
water.
all of those. Guess what it also is? It's when you look up and it's the clouds. It's also the sunflower. It's also energy, but it's always water. And so leadership is leadership. Don't worry about the manifestation. And that's where we get in the mud when we talk about leadership theory, idiosyncrasies, ideologies, philosophies. It's like it just is. And it takes on different morphoses when it needs to make the indelible impact that is called for at that given moment in time.
Mhm.
So one day it does look like inspiration. And in the very next moment, it looks like a call to war. But in the very next moment, it looks like a prayer for peace. But it's always leadership. And my point is, people get too stuck in the mud. Well, we need to define or use this certain leadership theory. My question is, why? And if you can answer the why with a reasonable response, then you're probably right. But if your answer to the why isn't reasonable and it's just the old theory of, well, it's the way we've always defined it, then that's not a reasonable response. But if your response is shaped by the call to action, little Sam didn't have a sandwich, and so I'm breaking mine in half to share with Sam, that's leadership. I'm walking through the parking lot and a mugger is trying to steal a purse from someone, and I go after them and stop that, maybe with a punch in the face, unfortunately.
Twice you
That's
said that today.
that's the leadership. I know I'm feeling really
We
feisty
got
today. I
some
need to go box or
aggression here.
something. Yeah.
Go exercise.
So yeah, the whole point is, don't get so stuck in the mud of what the theological explanation is, because there isn't just one. It takes on it does become the waterfall. It does become the cloud. It does become the sunflower. It does become the raging sea
Then
when that moment is needed.
then the question is, how do we know? How do we know when a person is demonstrating leadership
Yeah.
at any particular moment in time? Because
So
I wouldn't have necessarily said, oh, well, the 5-year-old boy,
right.
split his sandwich in half. I wouldn't have necessarily said, well, he's demonstrating leadership at that very moment. He might have been demonstrating kindness,
Right.
and humility, and what other adjective you want to qualify that with. But maybe, and then as soon as you said that, now I'm thinking, biblical stories here, because
Sure.
we've got this person, Jesus, who then feeds the multitude. There's a story of 4,000 and a story of 5,000 through the multiplication of, bread and fish. Not quite sure how that was done, but at any rate, is that leadership, or is that compassion on his people, or does it even matter that we defined it in either way?
I would say yes to all of it.
Okay.
I would say yes to all of it, because think about this for a second. Let's switch the scene a little bit. There's a community that's a food desert. They have no access to healthy food. That's
Okay.
what a food desert is.
Okay.
Someone comes in and finds resources and starts a nonprofit who now remedies the food desert situation. Would you categorize that person as a leader? They started a
You
business.
you could
They
well
found the resources. They have a team, and they've begun
meeting and
feeding
eat.
the hungry.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Are they a leader?
If we scale it back and say they've made an impact, absolutely.
Yes.
Did
Yep,
they
they're a
show
leader.
compassion? Did they find a pain
They
point and
did.
solve it? They sure did.
Yep. They sure did. So it's all of the above. So go to our little kindergartner, Sam, who's 5 years old, who gave their sandwich. The only reason we wouldn't consider that leadership is because most likely
5.
their age.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you all of a sudden take that same scenario, scale it up to a community that's a food desert, now someone comes in, builds a business, finds the resources, has a team. Now we're like, ooh, they're a great leader in the community. So is Sam. They did the same exact thing, maybe for one.
Scale is
But if we
different.
do it for one, we've done it for the many. If we don't do it for one, we haven't done it for any. So really, when you think about that, it's like, no, that is truly leadership, and it's leadership at its best.
So I'm just going to throw this as a wrench, but I don't want to really dive into it today. Then I think the term leader and leadership is either overused or poorly used because we use it a lot, and especially on social media and certain platforms where that seems to be 50%, if not more, of the conversation, that we're trying to define it, categorize it, identify it, put people in it, and so forth and so on. And that seems to be the only conversation that people have, and we're having it right now. I don't,
Yeah,
again, so
I
it's
think
not
you're
so
exactly
much.
right. And we
Go
won't go deeper into that, but I will make a statement. And you hear this quite often. What makes a great leader? My response has almost always been, what makes a great human? Because they're one and the same. There's no differentiation. And we do, again, I'll go back to, as humans, we're very uncomfortable in the uncomfortable. So when we can't define something, we get really, really anxious. And so that's why we begin getting stuck in the mud. Is it's like, well, oh my gosh, I don't understand it. So I need to put words to this understanding so that I can comprehend it and then validate my comprehension to others. But the real knowing is in the uncomfortable, because it's only in the uncomfortable that we ignite curiosity. The problem is we discover something and we hang on to that. And that only curiosity becomes our flag, our sacred cow. And when someone comes and challenges that, so someone learns, well, I like this leadership theory. This is the definition of leadership I'm going to hang on to. And anyone comes with a different perspective, not even challenging perspective, just a varied perspective. Well, I learned leadership as the peaceful lake. Well, that's not leadership. Well, who says? And so it's this, but again, that's human behavior, right? We get really comfortable with something, we hang on to it, we pretty it up, we tidy it up, we validate ourselves with it. And anyone who offers something different, we push away. When really, at our best, we should open up and say, ooh, that's interesting. Tell me more, because I want to hear what your vision of leadership is. And that's, in different words, that's exactly what I talk about in How to Hire and Keep Great People, especially when we're talking about culture. The reason it's so important to bring different voices and perspectives to the table when it comes to designing culture and teams is because you don't want that sacred cow. You don't want that one thing that becomes your, for lack of a better word, God, what you worship, your idol. When you have that, you've all of a sudden eradicated and pushed out any other theories, perspectives, ideas. And that's very dangerous ground.
And I think that's a good thought to hang on to as we close out episode 1 of season 2 of the Question Guy podcast. Mitch Gray, as always, it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And we'll do it again because we're under contract.
Season 2, let's go. Season 2. Good job, man. Proud of you.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.